Hi, everybody. I'm James MacDonald, Artistic Director of Western Canada Theatre, and welcome to another episode of The Snow Must Go On. I'm coming to you tonight from the Sagebrush Theatre on the traditional territory of Tecumseh in the beautiful city of Kamloops, British Columbia. Tonight's performance is an enduring reminder of the need for charity, benevolence, and goodwill to our fellow human beings, especially at this time of year. It's a reading of the timeless classic, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is a one-person performance, and that one person is me. It'll be presented in two parts, part one tonight and part two tomorrow. We hope you enjoy the show.
A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Marley was dead. To begin with, old Marley was dead as a doornail. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole friend, and his sole mourner, and not even Scrooge was so dreadfully cut up by the sad event. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, and his thin lips blue. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. Scrooge edged his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time, on all the good days of the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, and he could hear the people in the street outside beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices. Scrooge kept a wary eye upon his clerk, who sat in a dismal little room beyond. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was built of just one coal. The clerk had wrapped himself in his threadbare scarf and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, Fred. "Bah," said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow, his face was ruddy and handsome, and his eyes sparkled. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I am sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew. "What reason have you to be dismal, Uncle? You're rich enough." Having no better answer, Scrooge said, "Bah," again, and followed it up with, "Humbug! Don't be cross, Uncle. What else can I be when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you, huh? But a time for paying bills without money. A time for finding yourself a year older, but not an hour richer. If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. "Nephew," returned the uncle, "keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine. But you don't keep it. Well, then let me leave it alone, then. Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of other people as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and it will do me good, and I say, God bless it." At this, Scrooge's clerk involuntarily applauded. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep Christmas by losing your situation." "You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he said, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." "Never." "But why? Why? Why did you get married?" "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, Uncle, you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," growled Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the visit in a homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge, "and a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon." His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. Remember to bestow cheery greetings of the season to the clerk as he left. In departure, Scrooge's nephew had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and they bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to a list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night." "Well, we have no doubt his generosity is well represented by his surviving partner. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at this time of year. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir." "Are there no prisons?" said Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman. "And the Union workhouses, are they still in operation?" "They are. Still, I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, I imagine?" "Both very busy, sir." "Well, I am very glad to hear it," said Scrooge. "I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course." "You misunderstand us, sir," said the gentleman. "We are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing." "Oh, you wish to remain anonymous. I wish to be left alone," barked Scrooge. "I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." "But, Mr. Scrooge, many can't go there, and many would rather die." "Well, if they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon." Seeing clearly it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers and grocers did a splendid trade, a glorious pageant. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. A daring caroller stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, but at the first sound of "God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing ye dismay," Scrooge growled viciously at the door, and the singer fled in terror. The hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool, and his clerk snuffed out his candle. "You'll want all day off tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "Well, if it's quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to hold back £0.50 for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, wouldn't you?" The clerk only smiled faintly. "And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." "Only once a year, sir," said the clerk. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." "Oh, I will, sir. Thank you, sir," the clerk effused, and Scrooge stormed out with a growl. Scrooge took his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms. Now, there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. And then, let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge saw on the door not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but he turned the knob sturdily, walked in, and lit his candle. He did pause to look cautiously behind the door, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail. But there was nothing there, so he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed the door with a bang. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He walked across the hall and up the stairs, his candle before him. Up Scrooge went. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. Sitting room, bedroom, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, and a little saucepan of gruel upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. He put on his dressing gown and slippers, his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. "Humbug," said Scrooge, as he looked about the room with some unease. His glance happened to rest upon a disused bell that hung in the room. It was with great astonishment and with some dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound. Then he heard the noise much louder, on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his very eyes. The same face, the very same. Marley, in his pigtail waistcoat, tights, and boots. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see 2 buttons on the coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. Scrooge felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was. Who are you, then? Said Scrooge, raising his voice. You're particular for a shade. In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. Can you sit down? Said Scrooge. I can. Do it, then. The ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me? Observed the ghost. I don't. Why do you doubt your senses? Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You might be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than the grave of you, whatever you are. Humbug! Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror. For the specter's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. You see this toothpick? Said Scrooge. I do, replied the ghost. You're not looking at it, said Scrooge. But I see it, notwithstanding. Well, I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug! At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such an appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair and screamed. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. Mercy, he said, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not? I do, said Scrooge, I must. But why do spirits walk the earth? And why do they come to me? It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to a happiness. Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain, and wrung its shadowy hands. Jacob, said Scrooge, you are fettered. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wear it. Is its pattern strange to you? And do you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full and heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since, Ebenezer. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Jacob, he said imploringly, speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none to give, said Marley. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me! In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing, whole and weary journeys lie before me. 7 years dead, said Scrooge, and traveling all the time? The whole time? No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse, not to know that no amount of regret can make amends for one's life opportunity misused. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob. Business! Roared the ghost. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. And now, at this time of the rolling year, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? Scrooge began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," said the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me, Jacob, pray." "I am here tonight to warn you, Ebenezer. You have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer." "You are always a good friend to me, Jacob," said Scrooge. "Thank ye." "You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? 3 spirits?" "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it done with, Jacob?" "Look to see me no more," said the ghost. "And look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." When it had said these words, the spectre walked backward from him, the window opening behind him. Scrooge became aware of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret. He followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human affairs and had lost the power forever. Marley's spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out on the bleak, dark night. Marley's voice faded with that of the creatures, and the night became as it had been before. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was still double-locked. He tried to say "humbug," but it stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone or the lateness of the hour, he went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep at the instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the window of his chamber. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself that it was all a dream, his mind presented the same problem to be worked through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until he remembered that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour had passed. At length it broke upon his listening ear. "The hour," said Scrooge triumphantly. "The hour and nothing else." He had spoken before the hour bell sounded, which it did now with a deep, dull, hollow melancholy. 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Scrooge found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle on it. It wore a tunic of the purest white, trimmed with flowers. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, but the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light by which all was visible. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle. "Who and what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past." Scrooge made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare." Scrooge could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. It put out its strong hand as it spoke and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me." The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. Scrooge rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. "I am a mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either side. The city had entirely vanished. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. "Good heaven!" said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. I was a boy here." "You recollect the way?" asked the spirit. "Remember it," said Scrooge. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them, with boys on their backs. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other. "These are but shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The happy travelers came on, and Scrooge knew and named every one of them. Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas? What good had it ever done to him? They left the high road and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick. "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room. At a bare desk, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge wept to see his former forgotten self as he used to be. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments stood outside the window with an axe in his belt. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, I know. One Christmas time when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come just like that." To hear Scrooge in a most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city, indeed. "Poor boy, I wish," said Scrooge, putting his hand to his pocket, drying his eyes with his cuff. "Ah, but it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge, "nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, "Let's see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room changed. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the holidays. He was older, not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. The door opened, and a young girl came darting in and put her arms about his neck and addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands, "to bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful of glee. "Home, for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed, that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me here to bring you. And you're never to come back here. But first we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world." "You are quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed young Scrooge. She clapped her hands and laughed and embraced him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door. "Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost. "But she had a large heart." "So she had," cried old Scrooge. "You're right. I will not deny it, Spirit." "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children?" "One child." "True. Your nephew, Fred." Scrooge paused and muttered, "Yes, my nephew." Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfare of a city. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it?" said Scrooge. "I was apprenticed here." They went in and saw an old gentleman in a tall Welsh wig sitting behind a high desk. Scrooge cried in great amazement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart! It's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now grown into a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick Wilkins." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas Ebenezer." And with a sharp clap of his hands, he cried, "Hilly-ho! Clear away, my lads! Let's have lots of room here! Hilly-ho, Dick! Chirrup, Ebenezer!" Clear away! It was done in a minute. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright as a ballroom. In came a fiddler with a music book. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 little Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose heart they broke. In came all the young men and women absorbed and employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. There were dances and games and more dances. There was cake, there was a great piece of cold roast, and there were mince pies, plenty of beer and music. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and he became conscious that it was looking full upon him. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small? Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that, Spirit," said Scrooge. "He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. His power lay in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add or count them up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing in particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think." "No," said Scrooge. "I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk, Bob Cratchit. That's all." "My time grows short," said the spirit, quickly. Again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of greed. There was an eager, restless motion in his eyes. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a morning dress, in whose eyes there were tears. "It matters little to you," she said softly. "Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come as I would have tried to do, I have no cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" young Scrooge demanded. "A golden one." "This is the even-handed dealing of the world," he said. "There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth." "You fear the world too much," she answered gently. "All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrossed you. Have I not?" "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I'm not changed towards you, am I?" "Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so. When it was made, you were another man. I was a boy. Your own feeling tells you you were not what you are. I am. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it, and can release you. Have I ever sought release? In words? No, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us, tell me, would you seek me out now and try to win me? No. You think not? I would gladly think otherwise if I could, heaven knows. But if you were free today, tomorrow, how can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You who now weigh everything by gain. I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. Ebenezer, may you be happy in the life you have chosen. She left him, and they parted forever. Spirit, said old Scrooge, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight in torturing me? One shadow more, exclaimed the ghost. No more. No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more. But the relentless ghost pinned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in a room, not very large, but full of comfort. Near to the fire sat the same woman as in the previous scene, but older, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in the room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there. The consequences were uproarious, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much. Now a knocking at the door was heard, and the boisterous group greeted the father, who came home laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly upon him, sat down with her and her mother at their own fireside. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Who was it?" "Guess." "How can I? Tut, I don't know," she added in the same breath, laughing as he laughed. "Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear. And there he sat, alone, all alone, Christmas Eve." "Yes," said Belle sadly. "I have heard. He is alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe." "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of things that have been," said the ghost, "that they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me," Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost that looked upon him with a face which in some strange way was fragments of all the faces he had just seen. "Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer." He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and jerking up in bed, Scrooge became aware of a ghostly light shining in the adjoining room. He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange laugh was heard in the next room. And a strange voice called him by his name. "Come in, Ebenezer. Come in, Ebenezer Scrooge. Come in and behold me." End of part 1. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, part 2. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and jerking up in bed, Scrooge became aware of a ghostly light shining in the adjoining room. He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. He heard a booming laugh, the most extraordinary laugh. The spirit called him into the room. "Come and behold me, Ebenezer Scrooge." It was his own room, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were hung with living green. Bright, gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, and a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, juicy oranges, and luscious pears. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see. "Ha, ha, ha! Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly, his head hanging. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been. "I am the ghost of Christmas Present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge did so. The spirit was clothed in one simple green robe bordered with white fur. On its head, it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free, free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, and its joyful air. "You have never seen the like of me before, have you?" exclaimed the spirit. "Never," said Scrooge. "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family?" "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "No. Have you had many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800, said the ghost. "A large family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas Present rose. "Touch my robe, Scrooge." Scrooge did he was told and held it fast. All vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. The sky was gloomy, and the streets were choked up with a dingy mist. There was nothing cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad. The people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial, calling out to one another with glee. The poulterers' shops were half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. Soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and they went flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their happiest faces. They went on into the suburbs of the town. The ghost led him straight to the house of Bob Cratchit. Scrooge first saw Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-repaired gown, but brave in ribbons. She laid the table, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit, dressed in his father's monstrous shirt collar, plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose. "And whatever has got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha warn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, Mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Hooray!" cried the two young Cratchits. "There's such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times. "We'd a great deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, Mother." "Well, never mind so long as you are come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Oh, sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye." "Oh, there's Father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came Bob, the father, in his best threadbare clothes, and Tiny Tim hoisted upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron brace. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. She's not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming? Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha did not like to see her father disappointed, so she sprang out from behind the closet door and ran to his arms while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim into the wash house. "And how did little Tiny Tim behave in church?" Mrs. Cratchit asked. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped that people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he said this, and trembled more when he said, "Tiny Tim is growing strong and hearty, my love." Back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. While Bob compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemon, Master Peter and the two young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued, you might have thought the goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, and in truth, it was something like that in this house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrow. Mrs. Cratchit left the room nervously to take the pudding up and bring it. "Oh, supposing it should not be done enough, supposing it should break in turning out, supposing somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it." All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello! The pudding was out of the copper. "Oh, a wonderful pudding!" Bob Cratchit exclaimed. He regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for such a large family. At last the dinner was all done and the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered hand in his, as he loved the child, dreading that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live?" "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child shall die." No, said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my kind," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then, Scrooge? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, will you decide what men shall live and what shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child." Scrooge bent and cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "Oh, I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon." "My dear," said Bob, "the children. Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," said Bob, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before. They were not a handsome family, they were not well dressed, their clothes were scanty, but they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark and snowing heavily, and as Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens and parlors was wonderful. A flickering blaze showed a cozy dinner, and children ran out in the street to greet visiting family. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth," returned the spirit. "But they know me, see?" A light shone from a small hut, and inside they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The spirit bade Scrooge hold his robe and sped to sea. To Scrooge's ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, on which the waters chafed and dashed, there stood a solitary lighthouse. But even here, 2 men who watched the light had made a fire. Joining their hobbled hands over a rough table, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on, until they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke to his companion of some bygone Christmas day. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any other day of the year. It was a great surprise to Scrooge to hear a hearty laugh and to recognize it as his own nephew's. He found himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room. "Ha, ha, ha, ha," laughed Scrooge's nephew. "While there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor." Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends roared out lustily. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live. cried Scrooge's nephew, and he believed it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. She was exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. But I am sure he's very rich, Fred. What of that, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. He takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Well, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. What do you say, Topper? Topper, who had his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, said with a wink, Well, as a bachelor, I'm a wretched outcast, so I've no right to express an opinion on the subject. Oh, Topper, do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece. Well, I was only going to say that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him if he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday. After tea, they had some music. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp and played a song which had been familiar to Scrooge as a child. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that ghost had shown him came upon his mind. Scrooge softened more and more. They played blind man's buff. There was forfeits and a game of how, when, and where. Everyone played, and so did Scrooge. For wholly forgetting that his voice made no sound in their ears, he sometimes came out with a guess quite loud, and often he guessed right, too. The ghost was greatly pleased to find Scrooge in this mood, and Scrooge begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. Oh, I've got a last game, cried Fred. It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, only asking yes or no. He said it was an animal, a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked the streets. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter. At last, Fred's wife cried out, I have found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is. Well, what is it? Cried Fred. Why, it's your Uncle Scrooge. Which it certainly was. He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure, said Fred, and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready, and I say, Uncle Scrooge. Well, Uncle Scrooge, they all cried, toasting the old man. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is, said Scrooge's nephew. He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge. The whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and many happy homes they visited. The spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Are spirit lives so short? asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight, at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near." It was at this moment that Scrooge saw something horrible emerging from under the spirit's robes. A foot or a claw. A cold wind blew over him. "Look here," said the spirit sorrowfully. From the foldings of its robe it brought forth 2 children, wretched, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung upon the outside of his garment. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, ragged, scowling, wolfish. Where angels might have sat, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. Scrooge stared back, appalled. "Spirit, are they yours?" "They are man's," said the spirit. "This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom. Deny it, slander those who tell it ye, and bide the end." "Why, have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" And as his own words echoed in the streets, the spirit disappeared into the mist. The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him. The phantom approached, slowly, gravely, silently. Through the very air it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head and face, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. Its mysterious presence filled Scrooge with a solemn dread. I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment contracted as if the spirit had inclined its head. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any specter I have yet seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, I am prepared to bear you company and to do it with a thankful heart. Oh, Spirit, will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight towards them. Lead on, said Scrooge. "The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away, and Scrooge followed in its shadow. The city seemed to spring up about them. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. "Well," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, eh?" "So I'm told," returned a second. "I don't know much about it. Either way, I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first, with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous nose. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left it to its company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "Oh, it's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life, I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer? Well, I don't mind going if a lunch is provided, observed a fat gentleman, but I must be fed if I'm going to make it. Well, I'll offer to go if nobody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure I wasn't his closest friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Cold, isn't it? Seasonable for Christmas time. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. Who is this poor man of which they speak, Spirit? In silence, the spirit guided Scrooge away from the busy scene and went to an obscure part of the town where Scrooge had never penetrated before. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. The whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. There was a low-browed beetling shop where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, scales, and refuse irons of all kinds. Sitting by a charcoal stove was a gray-haired rascal who smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. A woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. Another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black. After a moment of surprise, they all burst into a laugh.
Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, said the first woman, if we haven't all three met here without meaning it. And you couldn't have met in a better place, said old Joe. We're well matched.
The first woman threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool and looked with bold defiance at the other two.
What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber? Said the woman. Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did.
That's true indeed, said the laundress. No man more so.
Why, then, don't be afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? Who's the worse for a loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose.
No, indeed, said Mrs. Dilber, laughing grimly.
If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, the wicked old screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had someone to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying there, gasping out his last there, all alone by himself.
That's the truest word that ever was spoke, said the undertaker. It's a judgment on him.
Well, it would have been an heavier judgment if I could have laid me hands on anything else. Open up that bundle, old Joe. Let me know the value of it.
But the man in faded black, the undertaker, sprang up first and produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value. They were examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give upon the wall.
There's your account, said Joe, and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?
Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner.
I always give too much to the ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself. There's your account. And if you asked me for another penny, I'd repent me of being so liberal and knock off half a crown. And now, undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman.
Joe dragged out a large and heavy roll.
What do you call this? said Joe.
Bed curtains, laughed the woman, leaning forward on her crossed arms.
Well, you don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there, dead?
Well, yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not?
Oh, you are born to make your fortune, said Joe, and you'll certainly do it.
Oh, don't drop that oil upon the blankets now.
His blankets, said Joe.
Whose else's, do you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without him, I dare say.
Well, I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh?
Said Joe, suddenly standing up.
Oh, don't you be afraid of that, returned the woman. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things, if he did. Ah, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it. It's the best he had, and a fine one, too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me.
What do you call wasting of it? Asked old Joe.
Or putting on 'em to be buried in, to be sure, replied the woman with a laugh. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in abject horror. Laughed the same woman when old Joe produced a flannel bag with money. This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive to profit us when he was dead.
Spirit, said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? He stood beside a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay something covered up. The room was very dark. A pale light fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, uncared for, was the body of a man. Spirit, said Scrooge, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me. Let us go. Still, the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. I understand you, Scrooge returned, and I would do it if I could. But I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power. I have not the power or the will to change. Scrooge had another thought, and hesitatingly inquired, Spirit, if there is any person in this town who feels some emotion caused by this man's death, show them to me. Spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him like a wing and revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her child stood anxiously. She was expecting someone with eagerness, for she walked up and down the room. At length she heard a knock. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a young man whose face was careworn and depressed. There was a remarkable expression in it now, though, a kind of delight, of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. She urgently asked what news. He appeared embarrassed how to answer. Is it good or bad? Bad, he answered. We are quite ruined, then? No. There is hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, there is, she exclaimed. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. She was mild and patient, his wife, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so. She prayed forgiveness and was sorry, but the first motion of her heart upon hearing of his death was joy. What his half-drunken landlord said to me when I tried to obtain a week's delay on our payment turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but it would be of bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes, their hearts were lighter. The only emotion that the ghost could show Scrooge, caused by this event, was one of pleasure. Spirit, said Scrooge, let me see some tenderness connected to this death. The ghost conducted him to poor Bob Cratchit's house, where they found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet. Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were still as statues. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing. Very quiet. The mother put down her work and put her hand to her face. The candle hurts my eyes, she said. The candle. Ah, poor Tiny Tim. They're better now, said Cratchit's wife. I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be past his time. Yes, said Peter, but I think he has walked a little slower than he used to these past few evenings, Mother. And she said with some effort, in a steady, cheerful voice, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Belinda, often. So have I, exclaimed another. So had all. But he was very light to carry, she resumed, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. Ah, there's your father at the door. She hurried to meet him. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits sat upon his knee, and one said, "Don't mind it, father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly. He looked at all the sewing and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. Then he said, "He'll have his little suit ready long before Sunday." "Sunday? You went today then, Robert?" "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there every Sunday." "My little child," cried Bob. "My little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. The family huddled close. They drew about the fire. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, who met him in the street that day. And seeing that he looked a little, just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. "When I told him, he said, 'I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, and heartily sorry for your good wife.'" "By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know." "Knew what, my dear?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "Why, that you were a good wife," replied Bob. "Oh, everybody knows that," cried the children, and laughed heartily. "Very well observed, my boy," said Bob. "I hope they do. Heartily sorry," he said, "for your good wife. And if I can be of service to you in any way," he said, giving me his card, "that's where I live. Pray come to me." His kind way was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. "Oh, I'm sure he's a good soul," Belinda Cratchit said. "You would be surer of it, my dear, if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised if he got Peter a better situation." "Oh, hear that, Peter?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And then," cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself." "Oh, get along with you," retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob, "one of these days. Though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting there was among us?" "Never, father, never," cried them all. "And I know," said Bob, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was just a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it." "No, never, father," they all cried again. "I am very happy," said Bob. "I am very happy. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God." The Cratchits faded into the mist, and the phantom pointed as before. Scrooge accompanied it until they reached an iron gate, a churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge advanced slowly toward it, trembling. "Before I draw nearer to the stone at which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be? Or are they the shadows of things that may be only?" Still, The ghost pointed downward towards the grave by which it stood. I understand. A man's actions will foreshadow certain ends, said Scrooge. But if the actions be departed from, the ends will change. Oh, say it is thus, Spirit, with what you show me. The spirit was as immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. No, Spirit, oh no! The finger still pointed. Spirit, said Scrooge, tightly clutching at his robe, hear me. I am not the man I was. I am not the man I was. Why show me this if I am past all hope? For the first time the hand appeared to shake. Good Spirit, said Scrooge, throwing himself to the ground, pity me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. I will honor Christmas in my heart, and I will keep it all the year round. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall thrive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they have taught. Oh, please, Spirit, I am not the man I was. I am not the man I was. With Scrooge's hands clasped and his head bowed, he did not see the phantom shrink, collapse, and dwindle down into a bedpost. Yes, his own bedpost, his own room. And as Scrooge realized with glee, best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own, to make amends in. I will live in the past, the present, and the future, Scrooge exulted as he scrambled out of bed. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. He was fluttered and glowing with his good intentions, and his tears flowed through his laughter. They are not torn down, cried Scrooge, folding his bed curtains in his arms. They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of things that would have been can still be dispelled. Oh, they will be. I know they will. I don't know what to do, cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath. I am light as a feather. I am happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. Oh, I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody and a Happy New Year to all the world. Oh, hello here. Hello, hello, hello. Whoop, 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 whoop. Hello. He frisked into the sitting room. Oh, there's the saucepan that the gruel was in. He danced around the fireplace. There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. Oh, there's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. It's all true. It's all true. It all happened. Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh. The father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs. I don't know what day of the month it is, said Scrooge. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. Oh, I'm quite a baby. Never mind. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Ooh, hello, hello, hello. Whoop, 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 whoop. The church's bells rang out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell. Oh, glorious, glorious! Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog. Clear, bright, jovial, stirring cold, golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious. Ooh, ooh. Scrooge saw a boy in Sunday clothes running by. Oh, hello, 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 hello. What's today? Eh? Returned the boy. But what's today, my fine fellow? Said Scrooge. Today? Replied the boy. Why, Christmas Day, sir. Oh, it's Christmas Day, said Scrooge. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Well, they can do anything they like. Well, of course they can, they're spirits. Oh, hello, my fine fellow. Hello, returned the boy. Hey, Do you know the poulterers in the next street?
Oh, I should hope I do, replied the lad.
Ooh, an intelligent boy. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there?
What, the one as big as me? returned the boy.
Ooh, what a delightful boy, said Scrooge. It's a pleasure to talk with him. Yes, my buck.
Well, it's hanging there now, said the boy.
Is it? Well, go and buy it, said Scrooge.
Walker!
exclaimed the boy and started to run off. No, I am in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, I'll give you a shilling. No, wait, come back with him in less than 5 minutes. I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at the trigger who could have pulled off a shot so fast. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. In an unsteady hand, he wrote the address, then went downstairs to open the street door. As he bolted out the door, the knocker caught his eye. I shall love it as long as I live, said Scrooge, patting it with his hand. I scarcely ever looked at it before. It's a wonderful knocker. He turned and saw the poulterer's man. Oh, here's the turkey. Hello. Whoop, 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 whoop. How are you? Oh, Merry Christmas. Why, that is a turkey. Well, he could never have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped them off like sticks of sealing wax. Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town, said Scrooge. You must have a cab. The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he paid the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he ran back into his house and chuckled till he cried. He dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth as he had seen them with the ghost, and Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile and greeted them all with a jovial Merry Christmas. He had not gone far when he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before. The gentleman, recognizing Scrooge, made to turn away. No, my dear sir, said Scrooge, taking the gentleman by both his hands. How do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you to raise money for the poor. A Merry Christmas to you, sir. Mr. Scrooge, said the portly gentleman. Yes, said Scrooge. That is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon. And will you have the goodness to accept? Here Scrooge whispered a large sum of money in his ear. Lord bless me, cried the gentleman. My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious? If you please, said Scrooge. Not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor? My dear sir, said the man, shaking hands with him, I don't know what to say to such munificent... No. Please, don't say anything. Just come and see me, please. Will you come and see me? I will, cried the gentleman. Oh, thank ye, said Scrooge. I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you. Merry Christmas. Scrooge went to church, and he walked about the streets and patted children on the head and gave money to beggars and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything could have given him so much happiness. In the afternoon, he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go and knock. Finally, he steeled himself, made a dash, and did it. Is your master at home, my dear? Said Scrooge to the girl who answered the door. Yes, sir. Where is he, my love? Said Scrooge. He's in the dining room along with his mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please. Thank ye. He knows me. I'll go in here, my dear. He turned the knob gently and sidled round the door. Fred and his wife were looking at the table, which was spread out in great array, to see that everything was right. "Nephew," said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how Fred's wife started. "Why, bless my soul," cried Fred. "Uncle?" "Yes, I have come to accept your kind invitation to dinner. Will you still have me, Fred?" Of course. Uncle, this is my wife, your niece." Scrooge took off his hat slowly and bent his head toward her in shame. "My dear, can you ever forgive a poor, unfeeling, heartless old man?" The shining face smiled up at him, kissed his cheek, and said, Of course, dear uncle, welcome. Welcome always. Oh, look, you've made Fred so happy." Scrooge was at home at his nephew's house in 5 minutes. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful music, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But Scrooge was early at the office the next morning. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming in late, that was the thing he'd set his heart upon. And he did it. The clock struck 9, no Bob. 1:15, no Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into the office. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door, his scarf too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello?" growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir," said Bob. I am behind my time." "You are?" repeated Scrooge. Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please." "It's only once a year, sir," pleaded Bob. "It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge. "I am not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore," he continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob a dig in the waistcoat that staggered him back, "and therefore I am going to raise your salary." Bob trembled and reached unsteadily for a ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge, with an earnestness that could not be mistaken, as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have ever given you. I'm going to raise your salary, and I will endeavor to assist your struggling family in every way. And we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a bowl of smoking bishop. Make up the fires, Bob, and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further interchange with spirits, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well if any man alive possessed that knowledge. May that truly be said for all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.